Jesus of Nazareth faced imminent death just as he lived his life. With an unswerving commitment to his calling and perfect submission to his Father's will, the road others believed would lead to his earthly glory led instead to abandonment, shame, and crucifixion. Jesus' enemies and followers alike believed it was the end of the line, but it was only the end of the beginning. Join us as we turn to the Gospel of Luke and explore Jesus' final days that led to the cross. As you discover the truth of the real Jesus, you'll find the source of your own story's significance.
I'm glad to see all of you today. I am glad that you are alive and well. And you know, we actually represent just a handful of people around the world. In fact, there are 8 billion people today who are alive and well in our world. And that seems like an awful lot of people until you remember that for every one person that's alive today, 15 people have died in years past. In other words, from the first humans till now, about 110 billion people have died. Now, of those 110 billion deaths, only one rocked the world. Only one shook the world. And that was the death of Jesus of Nazareth. His death shook the world literally and spiritually and eternally. And we are still feeling the aftershocks and the effects of what he did. And so today we have the privilege of looking at the unparalleled impact of the death of Jesus on all things. We're going to look at it from 3 angles today. The first angle is this: Jesus' death impacted the cosmos. Literally, it wasn't just a little thing that happened in the corner of Jerusalem. The whole world, the whole physical world was impacted. Let's look at the passage that we find in many of the Gospels. Luke also has it. By this time, it was about noon, talking about Jesus on the cross, and darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. The light from the sun was gone. What in the world? Jesus was nailed to a Roman cross, 9 a.m. For the next 3 hours, he slowly suffered. And at noon, usually the brightest time of the day, just the opposite happened. Darkness replaced light. How can you explain that? Well, we could be scientific and talk some about solar eclipses, because a solar eclipse is when the moon passes between the sun and the earth and therefore blocks our view of the sun. Of course, the problem with that is that Jesus was crucified at Passover. And on the Jewish calendar, Passover is always tied to a full moon. And you can't have a solar eclipse and a full moon together. So that's actually not an explanation scientifically. So we say, okay, well, let's try to be poetic. Maybe we should say that the sun went dark because it could no longer stand to see the Son of God, the creator of the sun, crucified. And again, that's kind of warm and thoughtful. But the truth is, as you and I both know, that the sun is all energy, not personal at all. It has no eyes to be averted because of evil that it sees. So maybe we should be theological. Theology means God talking about God. And darkness, I believe, that day revealed the judgment of God on sin. Executing the only good man who ever lived was so shameful for the human race that God actually blocked out the sun for 3 hours. You know, in the Bible, light always means God's favor. Darkness always means God's judgment or wrath. And if ever anything deserved the darkness or the wrath of God, it was the crucifixion of the spotless Lamb of God that Friday. So first, just out of the gate, Luke says that Jesus' death impacted the cosmos. But he quickly goes beyond that to say that Jesus' death impacted our access to God. Let's continue reading. And suddenly the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn down the middle. Then Jesus shouted, "Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands." And with those words, he breathed his last. Let's start with the temple curtain being torn. It says it was torn in half. Let me set this up for you. The temple complex in Jesus' day was gigantic. The whole area, not just the building of the temple, but all the grounds around it. It was built by Herod the Great, 40 acres. If you're saying, wow, Paul, how big is 40 acres? Well, it's 30 football fields. So any way you want to put together 30 football fields, that's 40 acres. That's how big, not the temple was, but all of the grounds with the courtyards and the meeting places and the other buildings. And the centerpiece of it all, of course, was the temple itself. Here's a picture of the temple that comes from the Jerusalem Museum. This is actually a scaled model that's outside that when you see it, you begin to get a sense. Out here, of course, is the court of the Gentiles, where no one could come. Then inside that was the court of the women. You come through here, and there's the court of the priests. This big area right here, and going backward, includes what's called the holy place, and then the most holy place, or the holiest, the Holy of Holies. Here's a cutaway shot of it that gives you better insight into what's in there. So this is the area where a handful of priests could come. Then there was a massive curtain. And this curtain separated what's here from behind. And that area behind is called the Holy of Holies. And that Holy of Holies was where they believed that God was. And the curtain kept anyone from getting too close to God, even the priests. In fact, only once a year, the high priest could go through the Holy of Holies, or through the curtain, into the Holy of Holies, and make a sacrifice for all the sins of Israel on what became known as the Day of Atonement, or our Jewish friends today call it Yom Kippur. Now, it's hard to understand exactly how big that curtain was before you comprehend about what it meant that it was torn in half. But here's about the size of that curtain. It was 60 feet high, about 30 feet wide. Well, that's a 6-story building, and architects say stories are generally 9 to 11 feet, so call it 10 feet. 60 feet high, width about half of what the height is. So that's the size of that curtain. Now, as Jesus was dying, the curtain was torn down the middle, we read. Was torn. That means it was passive. No human did it. Mark says it was torn from top to bottom, not from bottom to top. Now, you add those two facts together, and you quickly realize that God did this. The invisible hands of the invisible God, who is always spirit, reached down somehow in ways that are completely mysterious and powerful, and grabbed the top of that and just ripped it all the way down. He rent the veil. He tore the curtain. It was God who did that. It was God who destroyed the barrier between us and him. It was God who exposed the Holy of Holies to anyone, and therefore exposed God to anyone who wanted to come to him at any time. And so you may be saying, well, what does all that mean? What does this mean that this curtain is torn? That's a symbol, but a symbol of what? Well, here's what it's a symbol of. God opened the way for all people to enter his presence. All people. At any time, for any reason, the door's always open on God's side. In the New Testament letter called Hebrews, a letter written to Hebrew Christians, here's how the author describes it. And so, dear brothers and sisters, we can boldly enter heaven's most holy place because of the blood of Jesus. That's the symbolism. The curtain symbolized distance from God. Now, in heaven, we can go straight into God's presence. By his death, Jesus opened a new and life-giving way through the curtain into the most holy place. That means you and I have direct access to God anytime we want it. You may say, well, I really can't go into God's presence. I'm not important enough. Or I have done too many recent sins that I haven't confessed. Or if God really knew my life story, he wouldn't let me in. Well, the truth is, there's never a time when God is not waiting for you and has made access for you and has made himself available to you. Never a time when God blocks you from his presence. So I want to ask you a personal question today. Is there something in your life that you think is keeping you from turning to God? Is there something that's keeping you from praying? Is there something that's keeping you from talking to the Lord? Are you afraid that you can't appear before him because of sin or your own sense of insignificance? Have you forgotten what Jesus did for you on the cross? That the temple veil separating humans from God has now been torn so that all of us, Jew and Gentile alike who follow Jesus, can come straight into his presence. You can go straight to him today. On his side, he's done all that's necessary for you to walk straight up to him. On your side, all you have to do is take advantage of that offer. All right, so the curtain has been torn. Jesus has completed his purpose. His hour has finally come. And now he says his final prayer, and here it is. He says, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. First off, just notice the trust. After all the agony of the last 18 hours, he still says, Father, not my will but yours. Father, I still trust you. If anything should guide us in our moments of trial, it is Jesus saying right in the midst of it, to the bitter end, Father, I belong to you. Now, this prayer, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands, is a direct quote from Psalm chapter 31, verse 5. In other words, Jesus is praying a sentence out of the Hebrew scriptures that he grew up with. And now, two powerful thoughts come to our minds that we can think about today. They're both conjecture, but let's do that for a moment. First, in Matthew and Mark's gospel, prior to Jesus saying this prayer, he says another prayer. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That prayer of dereliction, God forsakenness, comes straight out of Psalm 22. That's the first sentence in Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? So stay with me. If Psalm 22:1 is my God, why have you forsaken me? And Psalm 31:5 is into your hands I commit my spirit. Is it possible that during those minutes or hours between those two prayers that Jesus was actually slowly working himself through the Hebrew prayer book called the Psalms? Like if Jesus started there in Psalm 22, makes me happy to think that maybe he got to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of deep darkness, shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy. I hope Jesus prayed this. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Did he get to Psalm 23? If so, did he also get to Psalm 25, verse 1? O Lord my God, in you I trust. Do not let me be put to shame. Did he get to Psalm 26? Vindicate me, O Lord, for I've led a blameless life. Did you get to Psalm 27? The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear while I hang on this cross? Now look, we don't know what Jesus prayed beyond those two sentences. But isn't there some possibility that he just kept praying the Psalms? And is there not a word of wisdom for us that in the worst moments, when we can't find language of our own, we borrow the language of the Psalms to say what's deepest in our heart that we cannot articulate in our own strength? But there's a second thought I have about Jesus on the cross. For you see, the prayer that he prayed there is very, very similar to a prayer that Jewish parents have taught for centuries to their children before bedtime. Here's that prayer. O guardian of Israel, who neither slumbers nor sleeps, I entrust my spirit to you. Now, before I shared this with you today, I wanted to make sure. So I reached out to a Messianic Jewish friend of mine who's in Jerusalem, a man named David Katz, K-A-T-Z. And I said, David, I didn't hint. I just said, David, are there prayers that Jewish parents teach their children for bedtime? And he said, this is the closest one I've ever found. So now here's what I'm thinking. O guardian of Israel, who neither slumbers nor sleeps, I entrust my spirit to you. Is it possible that Jesus prayed that prayer as a child? Is it possible that Joseph and Mary held him and he would place his head on their chest or on her breast and they would read to him until he fell asleep in their arms as he prayed those prayers? And if that's the case, is it possible that the only good man who ever lived, the Son of God, Son of Man, hearkened back to those very childhood prayers as he hung on the cross and said, into your hands I commit my spirit, and then he fell asleep in his Heavenly Father's arms? I mean, is that possible? I don't know. I don't know exactly. All I know are two things Jesus said on the cross, but I'm telling you, either way, they make Jesus so human. And friends, we need Jesus to be human, otherwise we don't understand him. A year ago, my men's group for 16 straight weeks watched together. We gathered together and we watched, each of us for the first time, and then discussed afterwards, all 16 episodes of The Chosen, the first 2 seasons. Here's what my guys said, the guys in my group. Here's what my guys said every week when it was over, after they'd gone. Then I'd say, and? Somebody would say, I didn't know he was so real. I didn't know he was so human. I didn't know he was like us so much. We need that, and this passage shows us that. Jesus. His death opened up the way to God, and he actually showed us on the cross how to go straight to God, even in hardship. But there's one final impact, and that is that Jesus' death impacted all of us today, but also all of those who were at the cross that day. For you see, at the cross were all types of people, and Jesus impacted all of them, as we're going to read in just a moment. I know you weren't there. I wasn't there. But all of us are like somebody who was there. So let's take a look at two groups of people that Luke highlights. First, he highlights Jesus' enemies and says that the death of Jesus impacted his enemies. Next set of verses. When the Roman officer, that's the centurion, overseeing the execution, saw what had happened, he worshiped God and said, "Surely this man was innocent." And when all the crowd that came to see the crucifixion saw what had happened, they went home in deep sorrow. So two people, one, an officer, second, a group of people, a crowd. Those entities came to the cross with one mindset and left the cross with a different mindset. What in the world is going on here? Well, the Roman centurion was in charge of crucifixions. Talk about a miserable job. Talk about a job that should qualify for a cable TV show as the worst jobs in the history of the world. All you did every day was wake up and know that you had to supervise 100 men who had to supervise the vicious, violent, state-sanctioned murders of criminals. And that was your job every day. This guy's heart should have been so hardened that it could never be repaired. And yet, as this verse tells us, he saw what happened and his heart softened. And he turned to Jesus, God, and praised him, a pagan Roman centurion praising God. And then he said, this guy had to be innocent. Then there's the crowd. The crowd that watched the crucifixion also saw something, this passage tells us. They saw something that changed their minds. Because just several hours earlier, they were yelling, "Crucify him." And now it says they go home deeply troubled in their spirits. In the Greek, it says they were beating their breasts, which is a Middle Eastern or a Southern Hemispheric image of just terrible sorrow and grief. Now, what in the world did the centurion and this crowd see or hear that changed their hearts and minds? Well, first, they saw Jesus silent. What they heard was nothing come from his mouth, hardly ever, the whole time he was being accused and tormented. What they saw and felt was darkness. You know what it's like to feel darkness sometimes? That's what they were feeling. They heard Jesus say to one of the criminals, not, "I hate you and you deserve this," but rather, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." They heard Jesus give this tender closing prayer, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And they saw Jesus die, not writhing and screaming in pain, but peacefully and quietly. And when you put it all together, you realize that these people had a whole change of mind and heart about Jesus because of what they saw. And I have a personal question for you today. If you are completely honest, is it possible that you are an accidental enemy of Jesus? Just like the centurion or the crowd. I mean, they didn't wake up one day and said, "Can't wait to frustrate God's plans for eternity." They just were on the wrong side and stayed on the wrong side for a long, long time. When I say, are you an accidental enemy of Jesus, I'm not saying you hate him. I'm not saying that you take his name in vain and curse his name all the time. But remember, Jesus said, if you're not for me, you're against me. So do you tend to ignore Jesus in everyday life? If so, remember that the opposite of love is not hate. Hate's still another emotion. The opposite of love is apathy, where you just don't care. And when you and I are apathetic toward Jesus, then at that moment, we have become an accidental enemy. Now, if you find yourself in that boat today, there's great news. All we need to do is look at Jesus, crucified, dead, and buried, and we will change. The centurion changed, the crowd changed, and you and I can change. So it impacted Jesus' enemies. It also impacted Jesus' friends. And there are two sets of friends here that are described. The first is a man named Joseph of Arimathea. This is not Joseph, Jesus' father, or earthly father, okay? Let's read this. Now there was a good and righteous man named Joseph. He was a member of the Jewish High Council, but he had not agreed with the decision and actions of the other religious leaders. He went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Then he took the body down from the cross and wrapped it in a long sheet of linen cloth and laid it in a new tomb that had been carved out of rock. This was done late on Friday afternoon, the day of preparation, as the Sabbath was about to begin. Again, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin are the ones that called Jesus guilty and sent him to Pilate. But as you see, he disagreed with their decision. He was just in the minority. According to John's gospel, he was also a secret disciple of Jesus along with Nicodemus. And he wanted to give, now that Jesus was dead, an honorable burial to this man. So he went to Pilate, stood up on Jesus' behalf for the first time, secured permission to actually take Jesus' body down from the cross, wrap it in linen cloth, and place it in a brand new tomb cut from rock. Now, you and I do not bury people in tombs cut from rock. It's hard to imagine. But the first time I got a glimpse of it was 4 or 5 years ago, driving southeast from Caesarea down to Galilee, and out of the blue, on the side of one of these little small curvy roads, here's what you see. They just unearthed this a couple of decades ago, and those are simply burial sites dug into the rocks. In fact, you remember in Jesus' case, there was a big round cylindrical rock that was placed down in this area down here and covered it up. That was the seal. That was the protection, if you will. So that's not where Jesus was buried, but it would have looked about like that. And it took Jesus' crucifixion for Joseph to finally stand up for Jesus as a true disciple and friend. And that made me wonder, I'll ask you a personal question as I ask myself. Do you struggle identifying yourself as Jesus' friend? Do you ever struggle identifying yourself as Jesus' friend? To be honest, I do. I know I'm not supposed to. I'm a pastor. I'm supposed to do all those things right, but I don't. And one of the reasons is because I'm a pastor. And when you're having a great conversation with someone at the gym or on an airplane, and you're exchanging conversation and you're kind of building some type of a decent bond, and then they say, "What do you do for a living?" I tell you, at that moment, if you say pastor, I will tell you their first thing they'll say to you is, "Great, good to meet you," and they walk away really quickly. The other thing they'll do, especially if they're either playing golf with you or at the gym with you, they'll say, "Sorry, I cursed for the last 5 minutes," then they walk away. Now, either case, it's embarrassing. I've tried different answers. Like, well, I really try to influence people for good. I try to help people. I speak truth. Well, maybe I can't get there, so when I say pastor, it's over. And I struggle with that, and I struggle identifying with Jesus as my friend in those settings. How about you? Do you ever struggle identifying with Jesus as your friend? Do you know why? Whatever it is for any of us, if we will look at Jesus on that cross, just like Joseph did, we'll come out of hiding and we'll be ready to identify with him. But there's another group of friends here, and it's the women who are at the cross. Let's begin reading in verse 49 and then skip to 55. But Jesus' friends, including the women who'd followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching. As his body was taken away, the women from Galilee followed and saw the tomb where his body was placed. Then they went home and prepared spices and ointments to anoint his body. But by the time they were finished, the Sabbath had begun, so they rested as required by the law. Now, these women who followed Jesus, who were women disciples, are described in Luke 8, 1 through 3. Jim spoke about this in one of his messages last spring. But now we see them at the cross, watching him die from a distance. And after he was dead, they followed Joseph, who had his body, to the place where Joseph was going to bury him because they wanted to come back. Joseph didn't have time to anoint Jesus' body with oil and with spices. He just had time to wrap him in a clean cloth and place him in the tomb. So the women wanted to do the right thing. By the way, bodies stunk back then after a couple of days of decomposed flesh, just like they do today. So the women were doing simply a courteous, a religious, a social, a thoughtful thing that you would always do for a friend. These women wanted to anoint his body with burial spices. So they went home to get the spices ready, but they ran out of time because the sun began to set. It was Friday afternoon. That means Shabbat. And on Shabbat or Sabbath, you can't work. So they had to just wait. They could finally work on it late Saturday night, and then they could go early Sunday morning, which, of course, they did. And we're going to see the women next week because they were last at the cross and first at the empty tomb. It makes me ask you a question. Are you a friend of Jesus? Does he know it? Do others know it? See, Joseph waited until Jesus was dead to finally have the courage to really stand up for him. The women stood with him as much as they could in his ministry, stood near the back, and then quietly were trying to still take care of him even in his death. And I'll just say again, if you struggle in any way to identify with Jesus as your very best friend, just look at him on the cross. Just look at him on the cross. Just look at him on the cross. And his love for you will evoke love toward him. His friendship for you will call forth a desire to identify with him as your friend. As you know, today's message is entitled, Jesus Died and Was Buried. And this has been believed for centuries, probably for at least 15 to 1800 years, stated specifically in the Apostles' Creed. And here's how the Apostles' Creed phrase reads: I believe in Jesus Christ, who was crucified, dead, and buried. In other words, the purest, most godly human who ever lived on the face of the earth suffered like every one of us. He died like every one of us. 110 billion people. He died just like them. And if Christ doesn't come back during our lifetime, like every one of us who dies, Jesus died. And it bothers us. We say of all the people that shouldn't have died, it was Christ. But friends, that's a human perspective. Because actually, Jesus' death and burial are the logical conclusion to the downward descent of Jesus' life that he embraced in heaven when his Father called him to come to earth. Jesus' life when he came to earth was not from the bottom straight up and to the right. No. It was from the top, from heaven, down and to the right. Think about it. He started off in heaven, like we sang in that song earlier. From the heights of heaven, he stepped down to earth. He'd had unity with the Father and the Spirit, unity with love and joy and peace for eternity and eternity. Doesn't get any better than that. And then when the Father said, Son, it is time for you to represent the Godhead and go to earth on our behalf to save a sinful world, Jesus said yes. And he descended and he began going down to where he became, if it's possible to go any lower, I don't know what it is, a fertilized egg in the womb of a teenage Jewish girl, born in an animal feeding trough, born into Palestinian poverty. No one crowned him King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Most people didn't even know he had ever come into the world. He grew up as a manual laborer, learning from his stepfather. He lived with his parents for 3 decades, well beyond the time of adulthood at 15, and he was submissive to them well beyond when he probably could have been or wanted to be. At the age of 30, he was baptized in the dirty Jordan River. He faced tests from the evil one, and believe me, he had never known or seen or been tempted by evil before that moment. He taught, he healed, he loved for 3 years, but in the end, what was he met with? Opposition, betrayal, arrest, denial, unjust trials, torture, shame, then crucifixion, death, and burial. Really, you can't go lower than that. You surely can't go farther than from there down to this. Now, I know he didn't stay in the tomb, and you're going to hear about that next week when we finally get at Preston Trail to Easter in October. But until we get there, for today, we're leaving Jesus in a cold, lifeless tomb because he is crucified, dead, and buried. And we're looking at him. And we're going to gaze at him. And as we gaze, we're going to tell him how sorry we are for our sins that put him on that cross. And we're going to mourn his suffering and pain because while he did it for our sake, we wish he hadn't had to. And we're going to tell him we love him, and we're going to thank him for his love for us. There's so many ways we could spin this, but I can't think of a better way than just to ask you to bow in a time of prayer and let me lead us through this gazing at Jesus crucified, dead, and buried. Would you pray with me? Now, of course, when you pray, you can do anything you want with your hands. Some people like to set them quietly on their knees. If so, some people like to turn them palms up. It's more of a receptive position. Sometimes I like to put my hands together and clasp them like a little child who prays and just put it right over my heart. Whatever you want to, or none of those. But in this spirit of prayer, I invite you to think about Jesus and gaze on him. Gaze on him on the cross. Gaze on him saying the final prayer, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Gaze on him being taken down from the cross by a secret disciple who's now public. Gaze on him being wrapped in a white cloth. Gaze on him being placed in an empty tomb. Just gaze on him. And if you have something that you need to say to him or want to say to him, please take a moment and say it quietly to him. Now, if you look this way a moment, to help us with gazing on Jesus and thinking about his death and burial, and I've asked Warren to sing a song that is ancient. Now, I know in pop culture, ancient is 3 years ago, but we're talking ancient probably 800 years ago. Words in tune. A couple of the words will be not how we would have used them, or maybe a little foreign. All the rest will be so clear and so mystical that I think you will sense exactly some words that you're trying to say to Jesus, beginning with the phrase, "What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend?" The song is called "O Sacred Head, Now Wounded." And I invite you to have eyes open, ears open, heart open.
O sacred head, now wounded with grief and shame weighed down, now scornfully surrounded with thorns thine only crown. How pale thou art with anguish, with sore abuse and scorn. How does that visage languish, which once was bright as morn? What thou, my Lord, hast suffered
What language shall we borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? Lord, we don't even know the right words to say to you. Struggling to put together a handful of nouns and verbs and adjectives that might somehow make sense to express our deepest gratitude and humility before you for your catastrophic loss, your catastrophic gift in Jesus. Whatever words we find, may they always be motivated by your deep love for us. May the image of Jesus, crucified, dead, and buried, stay before us all day and all this week.